So there's a lot of different things that we can look at in this passage, discussing the apostles, discussing the disciples and the Passover, the last Passover, Jesus' institution of the Lord's Supper, this being, and I want us to put ourselves in Jesus' shoes at this point, this is ultimately the last supper, the last meal that Jesus has before his crucifixion. Think about all the things that's on his mind at this point. Think about all the things that in his mind have to be completed. And think about what he's about to go through. And when he sits down and he institutes this Lord's Supper, we see here where he says, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Jesus earnestly desired to be at this moment. He earnestly desired to be at this moment where he was going to sit down with his disciples. He was going to institute this Lord's Supper, and it was going to be a moment of reckoning, in a sense, because after this, we're going to see that Jesus is going to be led away. He's going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he's going to be led away to crucifixion. When we look at it, this is a verse that we're very familiar with, because every Sunday when we talk about the Lord's Supper, these are the items that we talk about. We talk about the fact that Jesus instituted this. He instituted the fruit of the vine and the bread, and he tells them what they are and what the purpose of them are. And then he goes on to say, he says, and he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you, this in remembrance of me. And likewise the cup, after they had eaten, saying, this cup is poured out for you as the new covenant in my blood. But behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me on the table. I want to take a moment. I want you to think about what I'm about to say. Jesus, the things he's about to go through with crucifixion, the suffering that he knows he's going to go through, the preparations that he has gone to get to this point, and the preparations that's going to go into it after this, and on his mind is what we just read. Behold, the hand of him who betrays me is at the table. Think about this. In this moment, Jesus is sharing this Last Supper with his closest friends, with these disciples, with these individuals who have been with him, these individuals who have seen him do wonderful things, have seen him do miracles, but yet Jesus in his mind also knows that one of those individuals that's there is going to be the one that's going to ultimately lead him to his crucifixion. Here's my question. Every one of us have probably gone through a situation in our lives where we have known about someone who we either don't trust, someone who has done us wrong, someone who has purposefully done something to us. And our response to them has usually probably been, I will stay away from them. Or you think about the hurt that has gone into it of someone who's close to you. Maybe it's a husband and his wife has committed adultery, and the pain and things that go through that, and now he has to learn how to trust her all over again, or maybe he didn't. Maybe it's a child that has walked away from the family and is no longer present in their lives. Maybe it's an employee of yours that has stolen money from you. Just add that picture in your mind of that individual. And it says Jesus knew that the person was sitting with him. What was Jesus' reaction? What did Jesus do? What did Jesus do? going to be a long class. He ate with them. Think about this. Jesus shares the Passover meal with his disciples, and he's indicating to them that the impending fulfillment of his purpose is about to happen. But despite knowing that one of his closest companions would betray him, Jesus demonstrates love and grace by sharing this intimate moment with them. And I'm going to leave you with a phrase that I ran across on an article that I read, and some of you may have ran across it as well. Jesus knew, but Judas ate too. Think about that. Let me repeat that. Jesus knew, but Judas ate too. What do I mean by that? Jesus knew, but Judas ate too.
That Judas knew what he was going to do, but he didn't know that Jesus knew, obviously.
Okay? Think of it from Jesus' perspective. Jesus knew, but did he push Judas aside? He knew that Judas was going to be the one who betrayed him. He knew that Judas was going to be this individual, but what did Jesus do? He let him eat anyway. And not only did he let him eat, but you think about the moments leading up to that. Jesus fed him. Jesus prayed for him. And I think we can also look at the verses there. You can see that Jesus, when they were making their argument over washing of feet, and Peter said, no, you're not going to do that. Jesus also washed Judas's feet. What does that tell you? How many of you, with a show of hands, how many of you would have let Judas eat if you knew? And there was dead silence. To me, that is the most remarkable thing that I was studying, that I was preparing for this class. That was the most remarkable thing that came out of my study. Was even though Jesus knew what was going to happen, that this man was going to be the one to betray me, he still let him eat. How many of you would have done that? How many of us would have been able, through our human weakness, and by human weakness I mean our ability to forgive people or not to forgive people, our ability to look past sins, our ability to look into the heart of someone rather than their appearance, how many of us would have taken that position Jesus took, or how many of us would have said, I can't do it? I'm going to just admit it for myself. I don't know if I could have done it. And we can add all kinds of scenarios into this of what he did, what he didn't do. But knowing that the person who is going to ultimately deliver you up, that's going to betray you, that's going to say, here is Jesus, this is the man right here, I'd have a very difficult time with that. But what's Jesus' response? Jesus' response in this case was, sit down, eat with me. Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, which symbolizes the sacrificial nature of his impending death and the establishment of a new covenant. And no matter what the circumstances surrounding it, Jesus, knowing that it was Judas that was responsible for it, he still faced Jerusalem. He still was facing the cross. And we're not talking about a long timeline. We're talking about a few hours, and all of these things are about to happen. So my point of all that is when we think about our weaknesses, my weakness, whether it is my weakness to be able to forgive someone, my weakness to be able to move past someone who I've forgiven, my weakness in looking at somebody and automatically judging them based upon their appearance or what they have said. Jesus says those individuals are still fit for the kingdom of God. And they can still eat. And so let that be our lesson, number one tonight. Judas ate too. Anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts regarding that in the Last Supper? I know we read all the Last Supper just to get to that one little part, but I think it's important in the context of it, it being the very last meal that Jesus had, and He let Judas eat too. Anybody have any comments, questions?
Sure, I think about it from Judas's perspective too. Can you imagine how hard his heart must have been to be able to sit there and hear Jesus say, I know someone's here that's going to betray me, and woe to you if you're that person.
Right.
I mean, he must have hardened his heart to the point where that didn't have an impact on him, because most of us would have run out of the room.
Absolutely. I mean, just the lump in your throat, just that little feeling that would have dropped when he would have said that would have been enough for me. But for Judas to sit there, and not only Judas to sit there, but Judas to sit there and even look at the Lord and say, is it I? I mean, that kind of tells you a little bit of who Judas was. I mean, you've already betrayed Him. You've already gone and you've given up Jesus, but yet you take the extra step and you say, is it me? And Jesus said, whoever's dipped his hand into this bread, it's he. Go do what you've already committed to do. Yeah, that to me would have been tough. I can't imagine ever being in that circumstance, but Jesus knew. But Judas ate too. Any other comments about that? Yes, Nathan.
Yeah, Jerry, I think how many of us too, if we knew someone was going to hurt us in that way, would go to them and ask them to stop or ask them to not. And I just think Jesus' petition in the garden, of course, was to the Father.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not your will, let this pass. And even knowing that he could have gone and tried to persuade Judas, he was committed to the Father's will, and his petition was not to Judas, it was to God. And I think that's interesting as well.
Yeah, and if you read some of the other accounts too, it kind of talks a little bit more about this. And Jesus, in his response to Judas here, is basically letting Judas know, I know that it's you, but guess what? The Son of Man has to be betrayed, right? And so although it's you, it's not necessarily you that is responsible for this, because I'm going to have to be carried away. I'm going to have to be crucified. And so whether it's you or somebody else, I'm still going to have to go through this. Which I think is interesting when you look at that from the perspective of Jesus. I don't know how in the world I could sit in the same table with someone who did that. But again, I think that just shows us the character of Jesus, and that's why it's so hard for us to like Jesus, because it's against so much of our nature to be like that. And depending upon how we grow up, right? Depending on who our parents are, depending on what our lifestyle has been. Some people are obviously way more forgivable and way more forgiving than some others. But I've known some people, there's nothing in this world you could do after you've wronged them to ever get them to forgive you. They hold on to that grudge and they never let go of it. And Lord forbid that be one of us. All right. Turn over to Luke chapter 22. What Nathan was talking about, we're going to read that and think about this. And think about this story too. After what we were just discussing, after we're thinking about the weaknesses of us sitting there at that table going, is it me? Is it me? Am I responsible? Did I somehow do that, Lord? And Jesus, knowing who it is, he escapes, and it says there in chapter 22, beginning at verse 39, and can I get someone to read that for me before I pick someone? Chase got it. Yep. 22, 39 through 46.
great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation."
Okay. So here Jesus is. He's at the Mount of Olives. He is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's praying to God. And of course, if we take the other Gospels and we read those and we compare those, we know that Jesus 3 times finds his disciples sleeping. We know that 3 times he goes and he prays to his Father a little bit further each time. And he's praying to God the Father, if this cup can be passed from me, please let it be passed from me. But ultimately, if it cannot be passed from me, let your will be done. And I think what's important too, something that to think about here is it says there in verse 43, you think about the agony that Jesus was going through. Again, Jesus as a man, the weaknesses that he had, knowing that what he was about to be tortured, he was about to be put on a cross. If you just think about one of those things, I can remember as a kid, I can remember getting a bad grade and the delay of going home and waiting for that whipping that I was about to receive. And that lump that I had in my throat that entire time leading up to it, and then the pain that came from that, it was torture. But can you imagine what Jesus is going through here? Knowing that this is about to happen. And he's praying to God and he's praying, Father, if it is your will, let it be passed from me. And I see in that verse 43, when the angel comes and he supports Jesus, that is God's way of saying, you have to go through it. But I'm here with you. I'm here to help you. And I think there's a lot to be said about that, because Jesus, before he ascended into heaven, he said, and lo, I go, and where I go, you can go. But he says, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. And so just like God was there for Jesus, he is going to be there for us. In the face of whatever mountain we may be trying to climb, in face of whatever torture, whatever death is in front of us, that's exactly what we get from this story. And just think about that pain, that lump in your throat, that anxiety that goes into that, where Jesus is crying and it talks about drops of blood that's going on from this. And what I understand from this is Jesus was not ready for this. He didn't want to go through it. But he did. There are a lot of things that we today probably go through that we were not ready for or we didn't want to go through. I've never been through a birth process other than sitting there and watching someone else do it. But I can imagine many women do not really look forward to going through the birthing process, although they know what is on the other side of it. And I think about Hebrews, when the Hebrew writer says, Jesus, for the joy set before him, endured the cross. Not looking at the immediate, but looking at what beyond the cross. And I can tell you, Jesus probably here, in this moment when he is praying to God to take this cup from him, he understands and he is praying fervently and he's expressing his human vulnerability here. But he's also expressing his submission to God's will. Which tells me that even in our weaknesses, we can still do God's will. His willingness to surrender to God's plan exemplifies his ultimate sacrifice for the redemption of humanity. He understands the depth of human weakness and the eternal struggles that arise when faced with overwhelming challenges. No matter what we are going through, we have a high priest, we have Jesus who has gone through those same things and understands. Who can petition the Father, who can talk to the Father. I know what they're going through. I know the pain and the suffering and the anguish and the anxiety that he's going through right now because I've been there. And so in our moments of weakness, we have to look at Jesus and say, how did Jesus do it? He prayed to his Father. Was that what you were going to say? Yeah. Yes, Gary.
Such really, really good points you're making here. I can't stress that enough. And you talked about the fact that he was 100% man and he was 100% God. And he was truly dreading this. There's no doubt that he was truly dreading it. But one of the things this says to me is that there's nothing wrong at all with us expressing our true feelings to God.
No.
And there was nothing wrong with him expressing to God that he was truly dreading this event.
Absolutely not. And if you read any of the Old Testament, you read any of the Psalms, David was very vocal. David had his moments where, he was fed up. He had his moments where he was just ultimately at his end, and he expressed that. Job, I think, is a very good candidate for that. Job, I say in some senses, towed the line between, I'm not happy with my situation. You read the Proverbs and the Psalms, and you read the Psalms that talk about, destroying your enemies and the anger that comes from that. And so, yes, I believe that's the human nature of us, right? Giving our petitions to God, not sugarcoating it because God already knows what we're about to say. But there's also a lot of wisdom in us giving that information to God. Just like when we are having problems with someone, we are told in God's Word to go to that person and talk to them. Why? Because if we let it sit in us, if we let it fester, it becomes worse and worse, and all it does is ruins us. And so when we go to God, that is our way of talking to God, saying, I'm angry. I'm hurting. I'm upset. I don't want to go through this. Just add individuals that may not be able to be here tonight because of X, Y, Z. They may not be able to be here because they're older now and they're not able to get out. They may not be here tonight because they have some kind of sickness that has debilitated them to the point where they can't be here. They would love to. And you hear them shouting to God, I wish I could be there. But it's in those moments that we have to think about what Jesus has gone through and how He responded to it. So what's our relationship? How does that relationship look? Jesus understands our weakness because He went through it. But He gave us a pattern. He gave us the idea of how to make it through it. We got about 5 or 6 minutes here. So what I want to do is I want to get through Peter's denial and talk about that too. Because again, I think that's another human weakness. So someone, whoever it was over here that volunteered, do Luke 22, 54 through 62 for me, please. And I don't know who it was that volunteered. Go ahead.
Having arrested him, they led him and brought him to the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them, and certain servant girls seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And after a little while, another saw him and said, "You also are of him." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, "Surely this fellow was also with Embry of Galilee." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So Peter went out and wept bitterly.
Again, one of these verses that we could probably spend all night talking about just this verse. Just these set of verses and who Peter is. And, we've done a lot of studies. We've done a lot of talks about Peter and how Peter relates a lot to a lot of us for so many different reasons. Peter is the same one who, when they come to take Jesus out of the garden, he draws the sword and he's ready to fight. In the moment, he's ready for whatever. But then fast forward, and he's following afar off. And then he's sitting around a fire, and people are talking about, aren't you one of these that was with Jesus? And Peter's response was, no, I don't know who that man is. 3 times. How did Peter get to the point where here he is ready to fight, to the point where he's sitting around a fire and he's ready to flee? Have you ever been there? One moment you're the strongest Christian in the world, the next moment you're the weakest. Jesus had already told him, said, you're going to deny me 3 times. No way is that going to happen. And catch what we read here. When it says, Peter said, verse 60, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately while he was speaking, the rooster crowed. What's the next verse say? You want to talk about your heart dropping? Think about that. Here you have Judas, who's at the table eating with Jesus, and Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And now you have Peter, who Jesus says, you're going to deny me. And Jesus said, or Peter said, no, that's not going to happen. And then that rooster crows. And then this Luke says, Jesus turned around and looked at him. Just think for a moment about those eyes of Jesus turning around and looking at you, and the disappointment. Not necessarily for Jesus, because Jesus knew it was going to happen, but the disappointment that Peter had in himself, knowing that he had said I wasn't going to do it, but yet here I am. And it says, and he went away and he wept bitterly. Now, despite Peter's confident assertion of loyalty, he serves as a reminder of the human tendency to succumb to fear and weakness, even after experiencing the power of Christ's teachings. Again, I don't think we can remove or forget the fact that Peter, all the great things he has done, all the great things he has been witness of. You know, 2 weeks ago, Jeremy was talking about the Mount of Transfiguration. Who was there? Peter was. And yet, now he's afraid. Ever been there? And so the lesson for us that we need to take from this is we make mistakes. We're weak. We do things that are shameful. We do things that we shouldn't do. There are moments when we can hear ourselves denying Christ and we almost get that sense that I messed up. We are weak people. We are not always strong. But I'm going to make this comment, and I want everyone to hear me out on this. We are not strong, but together we are. The reason you're here tonight is because you are not strong in and of yourself. And God recognized that. He recognized that even when you read the book of Hebrews, and you think about all the things that those individuals went through, the sufferings, the murders, people being dragged out. And the response was, don't go hide. The response was, come together. The response was, do not forsake the assembly. The response was, encourage and love one another. It's through Jesus' example, and it's through our love for God. That's why we're here tonight. And that's where the encouragement ends and begins. I'm going to read one thing and then I'm done. I'm going to read this and then I'll tell you why I read it. One last verse. Some of you may already have heard it or read it. Throughout my life, there was a series of verses that I identified as my verse. These were verses that in some way exemplified me or what I needed to become. I kept 2 Corinthians 2:24 through 25 on my bathroom mirror for years because I needed the reminder. Later, I took great encouragement from the promise of Matthew 5 and verse 6. Now that my life is over, one last verse has become mine. Though really it is not my verse, but yours. It is Hebrews 13 and 7. My work under the sun has ceased. I no longer speak the word of God to you or anyone else. However, the Hebrew writer himself, long since departed, imposes 3 obligations on you. The first is to remember. This is not a matter of sentimentality. Rather, just as there were important spiritual lessons in the word I spoke, so too there are important spiritual lessons in the word I lived. Do not forget them, otherwise you will be like the forgetful hearer of James 1:23 through 24. If you do not carry the memory of my life within you, you will gain no lasting benefit from having known me. Second, you must carefully observe my conduct. You must carefully consider it. In this, you must use discernment, just as you use discernment in evaluating any of the flawed heroes of faith in Scripture. At times you have seen me behave foolishly and even wickedly. My failings certainly are not worthy of imitation. Despite these stumbles, though, you know that I was a man who walked by faith. Not that my course is finished. Consider the outcome of that walk. My path was not always easy. I battled chronic depression throughout the time that you knew me, and my last year at Jackson Heights was dominated by a devastating terminal diagnosis. Ask yourselves then, if it mattered to me that I lived by faith, what would my life have been like if I had been an atheist to whom these things happened? For that matter, what would have become of me if I had been a weak, uncommitted Christian? You know the answer. Indeed, many of you have known the answer since you were small children. Those who wisely build on the rock can withstand the flood, but those who build on sand are swept away. I was not swept away. ALS invariably destroys unbelievers, but I was not destroyed. Rather, my faith grew stronger throughout my trials, and I finished my race with joy and hope. The presence of God in my life made all the difference. Finally, the Hebrew writer urges you to imitate my faith. Don't imitate my imperfections, imitate my loyalty to Christ. It is nearly certain that at some point in your life you will face trials that are beyond your strength too. It is absolutely certain that your life will end as mine has. The flood is coming for you too, and only the Lord can keep you safe. Build on Him, and you will never regret it. I believe that the spirits of the departed remain aware of earthly events. That is why we are encouraged to run our race before a great cloud of witnesses. If so, then right now I am cheering for every one of you. Run with endurance, lay hold of the prize. When you cross the finish line, my beloved, I'll be waiting to welcome you in. Matthew Basford's last words.